I was sorting through my emails when a notification popped up from my cousin Danny. Strange considering we hadn't spoken in months, not since the awkward Christmas dinner where he bragged about his new Tesla while Uncle Bob sat quietly in the corner, sketching on a napkin. The message was brief, almost cold. Uncle Bob passed yesterday. Funerals Thursday. Family meeting after to handle his stuff. My stomach dropped. Uncle Bob, the man who taught me to see beauty in broken things, who spent hours with me in his cluttered garage, pointing out brushstrokes and paintings nobody else understood, was gone. I hadn't even known he was sick. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The funeral at St. Mark's Community Center was everything Uncle Bob would have hated. Formal, rushed, sterile. Danny stood at the front in his expensive suit, delivering a eulogy that sounded like he was reading from a template he'd found online. Robert was a simple man who lived a quiet life, he said, his voice carrying that practiced tone he used in his real estate presentations. He enjoyed painting in his spare time and collected various items throughout his life. Various items. That's how Danny described Uncle Bob's passion, his life's work, the paintings and sculptures that filled every corner of his small house on Maple Street. I sat in the back row next to my parents, watching the sparse crowd of maybe 30 people. Most were neighbors, and a few former colleagues from Riverside Community College, where Uncle Bob had taught art history for 27 years before retiring. Aunt Patricia sat in the front, dabbing her eyes with tissues, looking genuinely heartbroken. She'd always understood Uncle Bob's love for art, even if she didn't share it. Behind her, Danny's younger brother Tommy fidgeted uncomfortably, checking his phone every few minutes. After the service, we gathered in the community center's back room for coffee and sandwiches that tasted like cardboard. That's when Danny called for the family meeting. "Look, everyone," he announced, clapping his hands together like he was about to close a real estate deal. "We need to be practical about Uncle Bob's estate. The house needs to be cleared out and sold quickly. The market's hot right now in Riverside, and we can't let this opportunity slip by." Aunt Patricia looked up sharply. "Danny, your uncle's been gone for 2 days. Don't you think we should take some time to— Time doesn't pay the bills, Aunt Pat," Danny interrupted, his smile never wavering. "Look, I've already talked to a few buyers. They're interested, but they want the place empty. All that junk he collected over the years needs to go. Most of it's probably worthless anyway. Old paintings, broken sculptures, dusty books. I say we rent a dumpster and get it done this weekend." My mother Linda shifted uncomfortably beside me. "Danny, some of those paintings might have sentimental value. Bob spent decades collecting them." Danny laughed, that condescending chuckle he'd perfected since making his first million in real estate. "Mom, let's be honest. Uncle Bob had good intentions, but he wasn't exactly an expert. Most of that stuff is probably garage sale quality at best. I've been in that house. It's packed floor to ceiling with canvases covered in dust. Half of them don't even have signatures." I wanted to speak up, to tell Danny he was wrong, that Uncle Bob had spent years studying every piece in his collection, researching artists and provenance, that those worthless paintings represented a lifetime of careful curation, but something in Danny's tone made me hold back. There was an eagerness there, a rush to dispose of everything that seemed less about practicality and more about something else entirely. "I'll take care of the clearing," Danny continued. "I've got connections with disposal companies. We can have everything out by Sunday. Put the house on the market Monday. Aunt Pat, you'll get your share of the sale, don't worry, but we need to move fast." The meeting ended with reluctant agreements and uncomfortable silences. As people filtered out, I approached Aunt Patricia. She looked exhausted, overwhelmed by grief, and the sudden pressure to make decisions about 40 years of accumulated memories. "Alex," she said, gripping my hand. "Your uncle always said you had his eye for art. Would you mind coming by the house before Danny's people clear everything out? Maybe there's something you'd like to keep, something to remember him by." I promised I would, though something about Danny's eager rush to empty the house bothered me. As I walked to my car, I overheard him on his phone in the parking lot. "Yeah, Jim, we should have the place cleared by Sunday. Trust me, there's nothing valuable in there, just amateur stuff and old junk. The real money's in the property itself." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the last time I'd visited Uncle Bob, maybe 6 months ago. He'd been more animated than usual, excited about some new acquisitions he'd made at estate sales around Los Angeles. "Alex," he'd said, leading me to his studio behind the house, "I think I've found something special, really special. But I need time to research it properly." He'd shown me a series of small paintings, maybe 8 inches by 10 inches, depicting coastal scenes with an unusual technique I didn't recognize. The brushwork was confident, almost aggressive, but the light in them was extraordinary. "Who's the artist?" I'd asked. Uncle Bob had smiled mysteriously. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. The signatures are unclear, and they..."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"Came from an estate in Malibu. The seller thought they were student works, but look at this light, Alex. Look at how the paint catches the canvas. This isn't student work." Friday morning, I drove to Uncle Bob's house on Maple Street. The modest 2-bedroom bungalow looked smaller than I remembered. Its blue paint faded, but the garden still meticulously maintained. Aunt Patricia met me at the door, her eyes red from crying. "I'm so glad you came," she said. "Danny's crew arrives tomorrow morning. I wanted someone who appreciated Bob's collection to see it one more time." Walking through the house was like entering a museum that had been closed to the public for decades. Every wall was covered with paintings of varying sizes and styles. Landscapes, portraits, abstracts, still lifes. Some I recognized from famous artists, obvious reproductions that Uncle Bob had bought because he loved the compositions. Others were completely unknown to me, signed with names I'd never heard of. The dining room had been converted into a storage area, for larger canvases, some still wrapped in brown paper with auction house stickers from the 1980s and 1990s. "Danny walked through here yesterday," Aunt Patricia said, watching me examine a small watercolor of Venice. "He spent maybe 10 minutes total, just shaking his head and muttering about hoarders. He doesn't understand that every piece meant something to Bob. Your uncle could tell you the story behind each painting, where he found it, why he bought it, what period it represented." In the garage, Uncle Bob's workshop remained exactly as he'd left it. Easels held half-finished restorations, and shelves lined the walls containing art books, research materials, and carefully organized tools. A large corkboard was covered with photographs, auction catalogs, and handwritten notes in Uncle Bob's precise script. This wasn't the workspace of a casual hobbyist. This was the domain of someone who took art seriously, who studied it with academic rigor. I was examining Uncle Bob's research notes when Aunt Patricia called from the studio behind the house. "Alex, come look at this. Bob was working on something special before he died." The studio was Uncle Bob's sanctuary, a converted shed with north-facing windows that provided perfect natural light. An easel in the center held a canvas covered with a paint-stained cloth. Aunt Patricia pulled back the covering to reveal a partially completed painting, clearly Uncle Bob's own work, but unlike anything I'd seen from him before. It depicted a series of smaller paintings hanging on a wall, painted with photographic precision. It was almost like Uncle Bob was documenting something, creating a visual inventory. "He spent weeks on this," Aunt Patricia said. "Every day after breakfast, he'd come out here and work on it. When I asked him about it, He just said he was preserving something important. I never understood what he meant. That's when I noticed them. The paintings Uncle Bob had been documenting in his canvas were the same coastal scenes he'd shown me 6 months ago. But in his painting, they were displayed in a formal gallery setting, with museum-style labels and proper lighting. Why would Uncle Bob create such a detailed record of what Danny had dismissed as amateur stuff? I spent the rest of the day going through Uncle Bob's research materials, while Aunt Patricia sorted through personal items in the house. His filing system was meticulous, with folders organized by artist, time period, and acquisition date. Most contained standard documentation, purchase receipts, authentication certificates for the more valuable pieces, historical research on various art movements. But one folder, labeled simply Coastal Series Research in Progress, contained something that made my hands shake. Photocopied pages from art history books, auction records from the 1950s, newspaper clippings from Los Angeles papers in the 1940s. And at the bottom of the folder, a handwritten letter from Dr. Emily Watson, a professor of art history at UCLA, and a recognized expert in early California Impressionism. The letter was dated just 3 weeks ago. "Dear Robert," it began, "thank you for sending the photographs of the coastal paintings you acquired. I must say, they are quite intriguing. The brushwork and technique are consistent with the Laguna Beach school of the 1940s, and the signature, while partially obscured, appears to match known examples of Edgar Payne's work from that period. However, I would need to examine the paintings in person to make a definitive attribution. If these are indeed authentic Payne works, particularly from his coastal series, they could be quite valuable. Edgar Payne's smaller studies have been selling at auction for anywhere from $50,000 to $200,000 each, depending on condition and provenance. I would be very interested in scheduling a time to examine them properly." Edgar Payne, even I knew that name. One of California's most celebrated early Impressionist painters, a founding member of the Laguna Beach art colony. His paintings hung in major museums across the country, and Uncle Bob might have owned 8 of them, paintings that Danny was planning to throw in a dumpster tomorrow morning. I searched frantically through the studio and house, looking for the coastal series. They weren't hanging on any of the walls, they weren't in the garage workshop. I checked every closet, every storage area, growing more desperate with each empty space. Finally, in Uncle Bob's bedroom, I found a small safe hidden behind a dresser. The combination lock looked old but functional. Aunt Patricia found me staring at the safe. "Oh, that old thing," she said. "Bob kept important documents in there, bank papers, insurance policies. I don't know the combination though. He never told me, but I had an idea. Uncle Bob had been a creature of habit, and he'd always had a sentimental streak. I tried his birthday, Aunt Patricia's birthday, their anniversary. Nothing. Then I remembered the date he'd retired from Riverside Community College, a day he'd called the beginning of his real art education. The lock clicked open. Inside were documents, as Aunt Patricia had said, but also a small wooden box. My hands trembled as I opened it to find 8 small paintings, each carefully wrapped in acid-free tissue paper. The coastal scenes. Even in the dim bedroom light, I could see the extraordinary quality of the brushwork, the way the paint seemed to capture not just the image but the feeling of standing on those cliffs overlooking the Pacific. The signatures were partially obscured by age and what looked like deliberate attempts to hide them, but with careful examination, I could make out A. Payne on each canvas. These weren't reproductions or student works, these were the real thing. Uncle Bob had found 8 authentic Edgar Payne paintings, and had been quietly researching their provenance when he died. I called Dr. Watson's number from Uncle Bob's letter, reaching her after hours on her personal line. "Dr. Watson, this is Alex Chen. I'm calling about the Edgar Payne paintings you corresponded with my uncle about." "Robert Chen. Oh yes, she said immediately. I was so sorry to hear about his passing. I saw the obituary in the Times. Has the family decided what to do with the paintings? I was very much hoping to examine them. That's why I'm calling. The family is planning to dispose of Uncle Bob's collection tomorrow. They don't realize what they have. There was a long pause. Mr. Chen, if those paintings are authentic Edgar Payne works, we're talking about potentially over $1 million in value. Payne's coastal studies are among the most sought-after pieces in American Impressionism right now. So your uncle was very thorough in his preliminary research. Can you prevent the disposal? I told her I would try, but my mind was racing. Uncle Bob had discovered something extraordinary, and Danny was about to destroy it out of ignorance and greed. But why hadn't Uncle Bob told anyone? Why keep the paintings hidden? And then I remembered his last words to me during that visit 6 months ago. Sometimes, Alex, the most valuable things are the ones people overlook. That's when you know you've found something truly special. That evening, I called Danny. Hey cousin, I heard about the clearing tomorrow. Mind if I come by early and grab a few small things? Just sentimental stuff, nothing valuable. Danny's voice was cheerful, almost relieved. Sure, Alex, glad someone wants some of that junk. Be there around 7 before my crew arrives. Take whatever you want honestly. It's all going in the dumpster anyway. I hung up knowing I had less than 12 hours to figure out how to save $1 million art collection from being treated as trash. Uncle Bob had spent his life teaching people to see the beauty and value in art that others dismissed. Now it was my turn to continue his work, to make sure his greatest discovery didn't end up in a landfill because his own family couldn't see past their preconceptions. The question was whether I could convince them of the truth before it was too late, or if I'd have to find another way to honor Uncle Bob's legacy and protect the treasure he'd spent his final months identifying. As I lay in bed that night, I couldn't help but think that Uncle Bob would have appreciated the irony. The family that saw his life's work as worthless junk was about to discover that sometimes the most valuable treasures are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the right knowledge and appreciation to recognize their true worth. I arrived at Uncle Bob's house at 6:30 in the morning, hoping to beat Danny's disposal crew. The sunrise cast long shadows across the front yard, and for a moment I could almost imagine Uncle Bob standing there with his coffee, studying the way the light fell across the neighbors' fence posts. He'd always said the best light for viewing art came in those first hours after dawn, when colors appeared most honest and true. My plan was simple: document everything valuable before it disappeared forever. I'd brought my camera, and planned to photograph the entire collection, creating a record that might help us recover anything important later. But as I walked up the front steps, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. The front door was already open, and voices carried from inside the house. Danny was there, along with 2 men I didn't recognize, all 3 of them moving through the rooms with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. One man was carrying a stack of paintings toward the front door, while another rolled up a canvas that had been hanging in the hallway. These weren't disposal workers, these were people who knew how to handle art. "Morning, Alex," Danny called out when he saw me. His smile was bright and innocent, but there was something calculated in his eyes. "You're early, good thing, because we decided to get started a little ahead of schedule." "I thought you said 7. I said, watching as one of the men carefully loaded paintings into the back of a white van parked in the driveway. "Plans change," Danny shrugged. "These guys had some time this morning, so we figured why wait. But don't worry, there's still plenty of junk left for you to look through. All the good stuff is pretty much spoken for." Good stuff. Danny had spent months telling everyone Uncle Bob's collection was worthless, but here he was, having professionals carefully pack and transport paintings with obvious care and expertise. I watched as they wrapped each piece in protective cloth before loading it into the van, the kind of handling you'd expect from an art shipping company, not a disposal service. Danny, who are these guys exactly? Oh, just some people who specialize in estate clearing, he said casually, but I caught him exchanging a glance with one of the men. They know how to dispose of artwork properly. Environmental concerns, you know. Can't just throw paint and canvas in regular dumpsters. It was a reasonable explanation, but something felt wrong. If Danny really believed the collection was worthless, why hire specialists? Why not just rent a regular dumpster like he'd originally planned? And why start early without telling the rest of the family? I walked through the house, pretending to browse for sentimental items while actually conducting an inventory. The dining room, which had been packed with larger canvases yesterday, was now nearly empty. The garage workshop had been systematically cleared of everything except Uncle Bob's personal tools and art supplies. Most alarming, when I checked Uncle Bob's bedroom, the small safe where I'd found the Edgar Poe paintings was standing open and empty. Danny, I called, trying to keep my voice casual. Did you guys find anything in Uncle Bob's safe? Aunt Patricia mentioned he kept documents in there. Just papers, Danny replied from the kitchen. Bank statements, insurance stuff. Nothing important. We're handling all the paperwork for Aunt Pat. But I knew what had been in that safe, and it wasn't just papers. The 8 coastal paintings were gone, along with any documentation Uncle Bob might have kept about their authenticity. I felt a growing certainty that Danny knew exactly what he was dealing with, despite his public claims about worthless junk. The men worked with quiet efficiency, and within an hour, they'd loaded most of the collection into their van. As they prepared to leave, I managed to get close enough to read the company name on the side of the vehicle, Morrison Fine Arts Transport. I recognized the name from Uncle Bob's research materials. Morrison & Associates was one of the most prestigious auction houses on the West Coast, specializing in American art from the 19th and 20th centuries. After the van pulled away, Danny turned to me with that same practiced smile. Well, that takes care of the major clearing. Feel free to look around for anything you want to keep. I've got to run to a showing, but take your time. Once Danny left, I called Aunt Patricia immediately. Papa, it's Alex. Did you know Danny was clearing the house this morning? Her voice was confused, slightly hurt. This morning. He told me they were starting tomorrow. I wanted to be there, to say goodbye to some of Bob's favorite pieces. The collection's gone, Pat. All of it. They loaded everything into a van from Morrison Fine Arts Transport. There was a long silence. Morrison, but that's the auction house where Bob used to attend previews. Why would a disposal company be using their trucks? That question haunted me as I drove home. Morrison & Associates wasn't a disposal service. They were one of the most respected art auction houses in California, the kind of place that handled million-dollar sales for serious collectors. If Danny was using their transport services, he wasn't disposing of Uncle Bob's collection, he was preparing to sell it. I spent the rest of the morning researching Morrison & Associates online. Their website showed upcoming auctions featuring exactly the kind of art Uncle Bob had collected: California Impressionism, early 20th century American landscapes, works by artists from the Laguna Beach and Carmel art colonies. Their next major auction was scheduled for the following month, and the estimated values for similar pieces ranged from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars. The more I researched, the clearer the picture became. Danny hadn't hired disposal services. He'd hired one of the most prestigious auction houses on the West Coast to evaluate and prepare Uncle Bob's collection for sale. The question was whether he'd discovered the Edgar Poe paintings and their potential value, or if he was simply liquidating everything hoping to find something valuable in the process. I called Dr. Emily Watson again, this time with more urgency. Dr. Watson, it's Alex Chen again. The paintings have been moved. I think they might be headed for auction. At Morrison, she asked immediately. That would make sense. They handle most of the significant Edgar Poe sales on the West Coast. James Morrison himself is one of the leading experts on California Impressionism. If those paintings are authentic, he'd certainly recognize their value. Is there any way to stop a sale if the paintings were taken without proper authorization? Dr. Watson was quiet for a moment. That depends on the legal ownership situation. If your cousin has legal authority over the estate, it might be difficult, but if you have evidence that the family wasn't properly informed about the potential value of the items being sold, that could be grounds for intervention. The art world takes provenance and ethical sales very seriously. After hanging up, I drove to Morrison & Associates Gallery in the downtown art district. The building was elegant and understated, with large windows displaying carefully lit artworks. I'd been there before with Uncle Bob, who liked to attend their public previews even though he rarely bid on anything. You learn more by watching than by buying, he used to say. Pay attention to what sells and what doesn't. The market tells you stories if you know how to listen. The receptionist was polite but guarded when I asked about recent acquisitions. I'm sorry, but we don't discuss consignments or potential lots until they're officially cataloged for auction. If you're interested in consigning artwork, I can schedule an appointment with one of our specialists. I was about to leave when a familiar voice called my name. Alex Chen. I turned to see James Morrison himself, a distinguished man in his 60s, whom Uncle Bob had pointed out during several auction previews. I'm so sorry for your loss. Your uncle was a regular at our previews. Always asked thoughtful questions about the artists and their techniques. Thank you, Mr. Morrison. Actually, I was wondering if you might have received some artwork from Uncle Bob's estate recently. Morrison's expression became more careful. Your cousin Danny brought in a collection for evaluation yesterday afternoon, quite an extensive assembly of pieces. Your uncle had excellent taste, even if he sometimes paid more attention to artistic merit than market value. Did the collection include any Edgar Poe works? Morrison paused, studying my face carefully. Why do you ask? I decided to be direct. Because I think Uncle Bob discovered something valuable, and I'm not sure the family was properly informed before the collection was moved. Morrison gestured toward his office. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. His office was lined with art books and catalogs, the walls hung with museum-quality pieces that probably cost more than most people's houses. Morrison sat behind his desk and opened a thick folder that I recognized as the type used for auction lot documentation. Your uncle was quite knowledgeable about art history, Morrison began carefully. When your cousin brought in the collection, I was surprised by some of the pieces. Several showed signs of significant research and authentication work. Your uncle had been thorough in his documentation. The Edgar Poe painting specifically. Morrison nodded slowly. 8 small coastal studies, quite remarkable actually. The brushwork and technique are unmistakably authentic. Your uncle had compiled extensive research on their provenance, including correspondence with several art historians. These aren't just Edgar Poe works, they appear to be from his most sought-after period, painted during his time in Laguna Beach in the 1940s. My heart was racing. What kind of value are we talking about, for authentic Edgar Poe coastal studies in good condition? Conservative estimates would be $75,000 to $150,000 each, but if the provenance is solid, and the condition is as good as they appear, some could reach $200,000 or more at auction. Poe's work has been appreciating significantly in recent years. I did the quick math. 8 paintings at an average of $100,000 each meant Uncle Bob's discovery was worth close to $1 million. Danny knew exactly what he was dealing with. Mr. Morrison, was my cousin aware of these values when he brought the collection in? Morrison's expression grew uncomfortable. Mr. Chen, I have to maintain confidentiality regarding my consignors. But I will say that anyone bringing a collection of this caliber for evaluation would be fully informed of the potential values involved. So Danny knows these paintings could be worth over $1 million. I can't discuss the specific details of my conversations with your cousin, however, I can tell you that we take our responsibility to sellers very seriously. We always provide comprehensive valuations for any collection we're asked to evaluate. Morrison walked me to the door, but before I left, he handed me a business card. Alex, your uncle mentioned you several times over the years. He said you had inherited his eye for art. If you have any concerns about this collection, I'd encourage you to consult with a lawyer who specializes in estate issues. The art world has protocols for handling disputes over authentication and ownership. Driving home, my mind was spinning. Danny had systematically misled the family about the value of Uncle Bob's collection. He'd convinced everyone it was worthless junk, while secretly having it evaluated by one of the most prestigious auction houses on the West Coast. Now he was positioning himself to profit from Uncle Bob's greatest discovery while the rest of the family remained ignorant of what they were losing. But Morrison's suggestion about legal consultation gave me an idea. I called my friend Sarah Martinez, who worked as a paralegal for a firm that handled estate disputes. We'd known each other since college, and she'd always been interested in Uncle Bob's stories about art collecting. Sarah, I need advice about a potential estate fraud situation. What kind of fraud? She asked, immediately shifting into professional mode. I explained the situation, Danny's claims about worthless artwork, the secret evaluation at Morrison and Associates, the discovery of the Edgar Payne paintings, and the family's complete ignorance of the collection's true value. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Alex, if what you're telling me is accurate, this could be a serious legal issue. If Danny has legal authority over the estate but is misrepresenting the value of assets to other beneficiaries, that could constitute fraud. How certain are you about the painting's authenticity and value? Dr. Emily Watson from UCLA has seen photographs and believes they're authentic. James Morrison from Morrison and Associates has examined them personally and confirmed they're genuine. Edgar Payne works worth potentially over $1 million total. Then you need to document everything immediately. Get written statements from both experts. Photograph any research materials your uncle left
behind. Most importantly, find out exactly what legal authority Danny has over the estate. If he's acting as executor, he has a fiduciary duty to all beneficiaries to maximize the estate's value, not misrepresent it for personal gain. That evening, I met with Aunt Patricia at her apartment. She lived in a modest complex about 10 minutes from Uncle Bob's house, surrounded by boxes of personal items she'd managed to retrieve before Danny's clearing operation. Her eyes were red from crying, and she looked exhausted from dealing with funeral arrangements and estate issues. Pat, I need to ask you about Uncle Bob's will. Who has legal authority over his estate? She pulled out a folder of documents that looked like they'd been hastily assembled. Bob never liked lawyers much, so he kept things simple. The house and most of his assets were jointly owned with me. But there was a separate provision for his art collection. My heart stopped. A separate provision. Bob felt strongly that his collection should be shared among family members who would appreciate it. He specifically named you, your mother Linda, and Danny as equal beneficiaries for the artwork. He wanted people who cared about art to have pieces they would treasure. I stared at the will document she handed me. Uncle Bob had been very specific. His art collection was to be divided equally among 3 family members, with each person having the right to choose pieces they wanted or to sell their share if they preferred. Crucially, any sales were supposed to be conducted with full disclosure of values to all beneficiaries. Pat, did Danny show you this provision before he cleared the house? Her face went pale. He said there was just standard language about personal property. He told me the art wasn't specifically mentioned because Bob knew it wasn't valuable enough to worry about. Danny had violated the terms of Uncle Bob's will and his fiduciary responsibility to the other beneficiaries. He'd misrepresented the collection's value, moved the artwork without proper authorization from the other inheritors, and was apparently preparing to sell pieces worth potentially over $1 million while keeping the other beneficiaries in the dark about their true value. I called my mother that night and explained the situation. Linda was furious, not just about the money but about the betrayal of Uncle Bob's memory and wishes. Your uncle spent his whole life teaching people to appreciate art, she said. The idea that Danny would treat his collection like worthless junk while secretly planning to profit from it makes me sick. We decided to confront Danny directly before taking legal action. Linda arranged a family meeting for the next evening, telling Danny we needed to discuss some details about the estate. She didn't mention that we'd discovered the truth about the collection's value. The meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock at Aunt Patricia's apartment. Danny arrived looking confident and relaxed, carrying a folder of documents and wearing the kind of expensive casual clothes that suggested his real estate business was going very well. Tommy came with him, looking uncomfortable and checking his phone constantly, like he'd rather be anywhere else. "So what's this about?" Danny asked, settling into Patricia's living room with the easy confidence of someone who believed he was in complete control of the situation. Linda looked at me, and I nodded. It was time to see how Danny would react when confronted with the truth. "Danny, we've been doing some research into Uncle Bob's art collection. We'd like to know more about your decision to have it cleared out so quickly." Danny's smile never wavered. "Like I told everyone, it was just cluttering up the house. Most of it was amateur stuff and reproductions. I found a company that specializes in responsible disposal of artwork. Environmental regulations, you know. Morrison Fine Arts Transport," I said quietly. "That's not a disposal company, Danny. That's one of the most prestigious auction houses on the West Coast." For just a moment, Danny's expression flickered. But he recovered quickly. "Look, Alex, I know you want to believe Uncle Bob had some great collection, but the reality is different. These auction people evaluate everything, even junk, just to be thorough. That doesn't mean any of it's valuable." Linda leaned forward. "Then you won't mind showing us the evaluation report?" There wasn't really a formal report, just a quick assessment. Like I said, nothing valuable. I pulled out my phone and showed Danny the photo I'd taken of Dr. Watson's letter to Uncle Bob. "This is a letter from Dr. Emily Watson at UCLA, dated 3 weeks ago. She's confirming that Uncle Bob's coastal paintings appear to be authentic Edgar Payne works, potentially worth $50,000 to $200,000 each." The room went completely silent. Danny stared at the phone screen, his face cycling through surprise, calculation, and what looked like panic before settling into defensive anger. "Where did you get that?" he demanded. "From Uncle Bob's research files, the same files you claimed contained nothing important." I pulled out copies of the other documents I'd found: auction records, authenticity research, correspondence with multiple art experts. Uncle Bob spent months researching these paintings, and he determined they were authentic works by one of California's most important early artists. Aunt Patricia looked stricken. "Danny, is this true? Are the paintings really that valuable?" Danny stood up abruptly, his careful composure finally cracking. "Look, even if some of those paintings are worth something, which I'm not admitting, the collection as a whole was still mostly junk. A few valuable pieces don't change the fact that 90% of it was worthless." "But you didn't tell us about the valuable pieces," Linda said quietly. "You convinced us the entire collection was worthless while you secretly had it evaluated by experts." "I was trying to protect everyone from getting their hopes up," Danny shot back. "You all had these romantic ideas about Uncle Bob being some great collector, but the reality is that he was a retired teacher who spent too much money on paintings he didn't understand. I was trying to spare you the disappointment of finding out most of it was junk." Tommy finally looked up from his phone. "Danny, that's not what you told me yesterday. You said the auction house guy was excited about several pieces and that we were looking at serious money." Danny shot his brother a furious look. "Tommy, shut up." But Tommy continued, apparently having reached his limit of uncomfortable silence. "You told me some of the paintings could sell for 6 figures each. You said we needed to move fast before the rest of the family figured out what they were worth. The room exploded. Aunt Patricia started crying. Linda began shouting at Danny about betrayal and dishonesty. Danny tried to backtrack, claiming Tommy had misunderstood, but the damage was done. His own brother had confirmed what we'd already suspected. Danny knew exactly how valuable Uncle Bob's collection was, and he'd been planning to profit from it while keeping the other beneficiaries in the dark. I sat quietly in the chaos, thinking about Uncle Bob and his last words to me about valuable things being overlooked. He'd been talking about more than just art. He'd been talking about integrity, about honesty, about treating people with respect. Danny had overlooked all of those things in his rush to profit from Uncle Bob's legacy. The meeting ended with Danny storming out, threatening legal action if we interfered with his handling of the estate. But we had Uncle Bob's will, expert documentation of the collection's value, and now Tommy's testimony about Danny's real knowledge and intentions. Most importantly, we had the truth, which was something Uncle Bob had always believed was worth fighting for. As I drove home that night, I realized that Uncle Bob's greatest lesson wasn't about recognizing valuable art, it was about recognizing valuable people and standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Danny had seen dollar signs where Uncle Bob had seen beauty and history. Now it was up to the rest of us to make sure Uncle Bob's legacy was honored properly and that his discovery received the recognition and respect it deserved. The real battle was just beginning, but for the first time since receiving Danny's cold notification about Uncle Bob's death, I felt like we were finally fighting for something Uncle Bob would have approved of the truth. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt since receiving Danny's initial text about Uncle Bob's death. The family meeting had exposed the truth, but it had also made one thing crystal clear: Danny wasn't going to back down willingly. If anything, being caught in his deception had made him more determined to move forward with the sale before we could stop him. Tommy had texted me late the night before, apologizing for his brother's behavior and warning me that Danny was planning to accelerate the auction timeline. I called Sarah Martinez first thing. "Sarah, we need to move fast. Danny's trying to rush the paintings to auction before we can legally intervene." "I've been researching estate law all night," she said, her voice sharp with focus. "The good news is that Uncle Bob's will is very specific about the art collection requiring equal division among beneficiaries. The bad news is that California probate law can be slow, and if Danny has temporary authority as the estate's administrator, he might be able to complete a sale before we can get a court order. What do we need to do? 3 things immediately. First, we need to file an emergency petition with the probate court requesting an injunction against any sale of the artwork until the estate can be properly valued. Second, we need sworn affidavits from Dr. Watson and James Morrison confirming the collection's value and authenticity. Third, we need evidence that Danny knew about the value and deliberately misrepresented it to other beneficiaries. I can get the expert statements, but how do we prove Danny's intent to defraud?" Sarah paused. "That might be easier than you think. If Morrison and Associates has records of the conversations with Danny, and if those records show he was informed of the painting's value while telling the family they were worthless, that's pretty clear evidence of fraudulent misrepresentation." I spent the morning making calls. "Dr. Ferschen receipt, 1 forning provable petition, 1 forning provable petition the Payne." Watson agreed to provide a written statement about the Edgar Payne painting's authenticity and estimated value. She also mentioned something that made my pulse quicken. "Alex, I should tell you that I received a call yesterday from someone at Morrison and Associates. They wanted to confirm my opinions about the coastal paintings for their auction catalog. It sounds like your cousin is moving very quickly toward a sale." My next call was to James Morrison's office. When I explained the situation, Morrison's assistant told me he was in meetings all morning but would call me back. That call came sooner than expected. "Alex, I'm glad you reached out," Morrison said, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he'd been thinking about our conversation. "I've been uncomfortable with certain aspects of this consignment since yesterday." "What kind of aspects?" "When your cousin brought in the collection, he signed standard consignment agreements giving us authority to sell the artwork. But during our conversation, it became clear that other family members hadn't been informed about the collection's potential value. That raises ethical concerns for us." I felt a surge of hope. "Mr. Morrison, would you be willing to provide a statement about what Danny knew regarding the painting's value?" "I'd be willing to discuss that with appropriate legal counsel, but Alex, there's something else you should know. Your cousin called this morning requesting that we expedite the authentication process and move the Edgar Payne paintings to our next available auction. He specifically mentioned wanting to complete the sale within the next 2 weeks. 2 weeks? Danny was trying to liquidate nearly $1 million worth of artwork before the family could legally challenge him. But Morrison's willingness to cooperate gave us a crucial advantage. I met Sarah at her law firm that afternoon. The office was modest but professional, filled with the kind of organized chaos that suggested serious work was happening. Sarah introduced me to her supervising attorney Michael Rodriguez, who specialized in estate disputes. "Alex," Sarah's briefed me on the situation. Rodriguez said, spreading Uncle Bob's will across his desk alongside the expert communications I'd gathered. "This is a strong case for emergency intervention. Your uncle was very specific about equal division of the art collection, and there's clear evidence that one beneficiary has misrepresented the collection's value to gain an unfair advantage. What are our chances of stopping the sale? If we can demonstrate that Danny knew about the painting's value while telling other beneficiaries they were worthless, we have grounds for both an injunction and a fraud claim. The expert statements you've gathered are excellent evidence. Morrison's cooperation could be decisive." Rodriguez spent the afternoon drafting legal documents while Sarah and I worked on gathering additional evidence. We drove to Uncle Bob's house, which Danny had finally locked up after clearing out the artwork. Using the spare key Aunt Patricia had given me, we searched for any additional research materials Danny might have missed. In Uncle Bob's study, tucked behind a row of art history books, I found a small notebook I'd overlooked before. Uncle Bob's handwriting filled the pages with detailed observations about various pieces in his collection, including extensive notes about the Edgar Payne paintings. But the most revealing entry was dated just 2 weeks before his death. "Spoke with Danny today about my collection," Uncle Bob had written. "He seemed very interested in the coastal paintings specifically. Asked detailed questions about their provenance and potential value. Told him about my research and Dr. Watson's preliminary assessment. He listened carefully but advised me not to get my hopes up about their worth. Strange advice, considering the evidence suggests otherwise. Need to be more careful about who I share my research with." Sarah read the entry over my shoulder. "Alex, this is huge." Uncle Bob documented that Danny knew about the potential value of the paintings weeks before his death. This directly contradicts Danny's claims that he only learned about them during the estate clearing. We photographed every page of the notebook and returned to Rodriguez's office. As he read Uncle Bob's notes, the attorney's expression grew more serious. "This changes everything," Rodriguez said. "We're not just looking at misrepresentation anymore. This suggests premeditation. If Danny knew about the painting's potential value before your uncle's death, and then deliberately misled other beneficiaries afterward, we could be looking at criminal fraud charges." The legal papers were filed that evening. Rodriguez submitted an emergency petition for a temporary restraining order preventing any sale of artwork from Uncle Bob's estate until a proper valuation could be completed and all beneficiaries properly informed. We also filed a formal complaint alleging fraudulent misrepresentation and breach of fiduciary duty. The court hearing was scheduled for the following afternoon. Danny would be notified that morning and required to appear with his attorney to explain his actions. Rodriguez warned me that Danny might try to complete the sale before the hearing, so we also served papers directly on Morrison and Associates, legally preventing them from proceeding with any auction until the court ruled. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Uncle Bob's notebook entry and his concern about being more careful about who I share my research with. He trusted Danny with information about his most valuable discovery, and Danny had apparently been planning to exploit that trust even while Uncle Bob was still alive. The next morning brought an unexpected call from Tommy. "Alex, I need to tell you something about Danny and those paintings." "What about them?" "Danny's been researching them for months, way before Uncle Bob died. I saw him looking up Edgar Payne auction results on his computer back in February. When I asked him about it, he said he was just curious about some paintings Uncle Bob had mentioned, but now I realize he was planning something." "Tommy, would you be willing to testify about that?" There was a long pause. "He's my brother Alex, but what he's doing isn't right. Uncle Bob deserved better than this." Tommy agreed to meet with Rodriguez before the hearing. His testimony would provide additional evidence that Danny had been planning to exploit his knowledge of the collection's value long before Uncle Bob's death. The probate court hearing was scheduled for 2 o'clock in Department 12 of the Riverside County Courthouse. Rodriguez had prepared thoroughly, organizing our evidence into a compelling narrative of deception and fraud. Watson had provided a detailed written statement confirming the Edgar Payne painting's authenticity and value. Morrison had submitted documentation showing that Danny had been fully informed of the collection's worth while claiming to the family that it was worthless. Danny arrived with his own attorney, a sharp-dressed woman who looked like she specialized in high-stakes litigation. They'd clearly spent the morning preparing a defense, but I could see tension in Danny's jaw and the way he avoided making eye contact with the family members present. Judge Patricia Hernandez reviewed the evidence methodically. She examined Uncle Bob's will, the expert statements about the painting's value, Morrison's documentation of his conversations with Danny, and Uncle Bob's notebook entries describing Danny's suspicious interest in the coastal paintings. "Mr. Chen," Judge Hernandez addressed Danny directly, "these documents suggest that you had specific knowledge of certain artwork's potential value, while informing other beneficiaries that the entire collection was worthless. How do you respond to these allegations?" Danny's attorney spoke first. "Your Honor, my client was acting in good faith to handle a complex estate efficiently. The collection contained hundreds of pieces, most of which were indeed of minimal value. The fact that a few items proved more valuable than initially assessed doesn't constitute fraud." Judge Hernandez looked skeptical. "Counselor, the evidence suggests your client specifically researched Edgar Payne auction results months before the decedent's death, received expert confirmation of certain paintings' authenticity and value, and then explicitly told other beneficiaries that the collection was worthless junk. That pattern suggests deliberate deception, not good faith administration." Rodriguez presented Uncle Bob's notebook entry about Danny's suspicious questions and advice. He showed auction records proving Danny had researched Edgar Payne values extensively. Most damaging, he presented Morrison's documentation that Danny had requested expedited auction of the most valuable pieces while the family remained unaware of their worth. "Your Honor," Rodriguez concluded, "this isn't a case of honest mistakes in estate administration. This is systematic fraud, designed to deprive rightful beneficiaries of their inheritance while enriching the perpetrator." Danny's attorney tried to argue that the expedited sale was motivated by practical concerns about storage and insurance costs, but Judge Hernandez wasn't convinced. The evidence was too comprehensive, too clearly showing a pattern of deliberate deception. "I'm granting the temporary restraining order," Judge Hernandez announced. "All artwork from the Robert Chen estate is hereby frozen pending proper valuation and division according to the will's specifications. Mr. Chen, you are enjoined from selling, transferring or otherwise disposing of any items from the collection. She continued, "Furthermore, I'm ordering an independent appraisal of the entire collection by court-appointed experts. The estate will bear the cost of this appraisal, and all beneficiaries will receive detailed reports of the findings." Danny's face went white. His attorney whispered something urgent in his ear, but the damage was done. The court had recognized the fraud and taken steps to protect the other beneficiaries. But Judge Hernandez wasn't finished. "Mr. Chen, the evidence presented today raises serious questions about your fitness to serve as estate administrator. I'm scheduling a hearing for next week to consider removing you from that position and appointing an independent administrator." As we left the courthouse, Danny tried to approach me in the parking lot. "Alex, look, maybe we can work something out. The family deserves their fair share of anything valuable. I was just trying to handle things efficiently." "Danny, you lied to us for weeks while planning to steal nearly $1 million from Uncle Bob's estate. There's nothing to work out except making sure you face the consequences." That evening, the family gathered at Aunt Patricia's apartment to discuss the court's ruling. The atmosphere was completely different from our confrontational meeting just days before. There was relief, certainly, but also sadness about the betrayal and the realization that family relationships had been permanently damaged. "I keep thinking about Bob's notebook," Aunt Patricia said quietly. "He knew something was wrong. He was trying to protect his collection from someone he should have been able to trust." My mother nodded grimly. "Bob always said the most valuable things were often overlooked or underestimated. I don't think he ever imagined that someone would try to exploit that principle against his own family." Rodriguez called later that evening with an update. "Alex, Morrison and Associates has agreed to cooperate fully with the court-ordered appraisal. They're also providing detailed documentation of their interactions with Danny, which could be useful if criminal charges are filed." "Criminal charges?" The district attorney's office has been notified about the case. Fraudulent estate administration is a felony in California, especially when it involves this amount of money. Danny could face serious criminal liability in addition to the civil consequences. Over the following weeks, the full scope of Uncle Bob's collection became clear. The court-appointed appraisers worked methodically through every piece, documenting provenance, condition, and estimated values. The Edgar Payne paintings were authenticated as genuine works from the artist's most sought-after period, with conservative auction estimates totaling $1.2 million. But Uncle Bob's discovery went beyond just the Payne paintings. The collection included several other significant works that Danny had overlooked in his focus on the coastal scenes. A small oil painting signed W. Wendt proved to be an authentic William Wendt landscape worth approximately $60,000. 3 watercolors attributed to unknown artist were identified as works by California Impressionist Granville Redmond, each valued between $15,000 and $25,000. Dr. Watson provided expert testimony about Uncle Bob's research methodology. "Robert Chen was more than a casual collector," she explained to the court. "His research was thorough and professional. He understood provenance, artistic technique, and market values. The idea that he would accumulate worthless artwork shows a fundamental misunderstanding of his knowledge and expertise." The independent appraisers confirmed that Uncle Bob's entire collection was worth approximately $1.8 million, with the Edgar Payne Coastal Series representing the most valuable single component. According to Uncle Bob's will, this meant each of the 3 named beneficiaries was entitled to artwork worth roughly $600,000. Danny's attempts to negotiate a settlement were rejected. Rodriguez advised against any agreement that would allow Danny to profit from his fraudulent actions. "He tried to steal $1.2 million from the family," Rodriguez explained. "The only appropriate resolution is full restitution and accountability." The criminal investigation moved forward parallel with the civil proceedings. Detective Maria Santos from the Riverside County District Attorney's White-Collar Crime Unit interviewed all the family members and reviewed the extensive documentation we'd gathered. "This is one of the clearest cases of estate fraud I've seen," Detective Santos told me during my interview. "The defendant had specific knowledge of the asset's value, deliberately misrepresented that value to other beneficiaries, and attempted to personally profit from the deception. That meets every element of felony fraud under California law." Tommy's testimony proved particularly damaging to Danny's defense. He confirmed that Danny had been researching Edgar Payne auction results months before Uncle Bob's death and had specifically asked Uncle Bob about the coastal paintings during family visits. "Danny told me he was going to be rich after Uncle Bob died," Tommy testified. "He said Uncle Bob had some valuable paintings but didn't realize what they were worth. I thought he was just joking around, but now I understand he was planning to take advantage of Uncle Bob's death." The final court hearing for Danny's estate fraud case was scheduled for 6 weeks after our initial emergency petition. By then, the evidence was overwhelming. Danny faced both criminal charges and civil liability for attempting to defraud his own family members. Judge Hernandez reviewed the complete investigative findings before rendering her decision. "Mr. Chen, the evidence demonstrates a calculated scheme to defraud your family members of their rightful inheritance. You exploited your position as a state administrator and your uncle's trust to attempt theft of nearly $2 million in artwork." She continued, "This court finds clear and convincing evidence of fraudulent misrepresentation, breach of fiduciary duty, and criminal fraud. You are hereby removed as a state administrator and ordered to pay full restitution to the wronged beneficiaries." Danny was sentenced to 2 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and full financial restitution for legal costs and expert fees. More importantly, he was permanently barred from serving as an executor or administrator for any estate in California. The Edgar Payne paintings were eventually sold at Morrison & Associates' spring auction, where they exceeded even the conservative estimates. The 8 coastal studies sold for a combined total of $1.4 million, with the largest and most detailed piece bringing $220,000 from a private collector in San Francisco. Uncle Bob would have been amazed by the final auction results, but I think he would have been more proud of the way the family came together to protect his legacy. The money was significant, certainly, but the real victory was ensuring that his life's work received the recognition and respect it deserved. As I walked through Morrison & Associates on the day of the auction, watching serious collectors examine Uncle Bob's discoveries with the reverence they merited, I could almost hear his voice commenting on the buyer's techniques and sharing stories about each painting's history. He'd spent decades teaching people to see the beauty and value in overlooked artworks, and his final collection had become the ultimate example of that philosophy. The remaining artwork was divided among the 3 beneficiaries according to Uncle Bob's wishes. My mother chose several landscapes that reminded her of family trips to the coast. I selected a group of smaller works that showed Uncle Bob's eye for emerging artists and unusual techniques. The monetary value was substantial, but the real inheritance was Uncle Bob's example of patience, research, and appreciation for art that others might dismiss. Danny's betrayal had cost him not just money and legal consequences, but his relationship with the family and his reputation in the community. The real estate business that had made him wealthy suffered as news of the fraud case spread through Riverside's tight-knit business community. Sometimes the most expensive price you pay is the one you don't see coming. 6 months after the auction, I found myself standing in Uncle Bob's old studio behind the house on Maple Street. Aunt Patricia had decided to keep the property rather than sell it, turning the main house into a rental while preserving the studio as a small gallery space dedicated to Uncle Bob's memory. The walls now displayed some of the remaining pieces from his collection, the ones we'd chosen to keep rather than sell. The transformation was remarkable. What had once been Uncle Bob's cluttered workspace was now a clean, well-lit gallery that told the story of his 40-year journey as a collector and amateur art historian. Display cases held his research materials, auction catalogs, and correspondence with experts. The centerpiece was his unfinished painting of the Edgar Poe
Coastal series, which he'd been working on when he died. We'd had it professionally conserved and framed, and it served as both artwork and historical document. Emily Watson had driven down from UCLA for the studio's opening ceremony, bringing with her several of her graduate students who were researching California art collecting in the 20th century. Your uncle's collection and research methods represent something important that's often overlooked in art history, she explained to the small gathering of family and friends. Most attention goes to major collectors and museums, but people like Robert Chen were doing crucial work in preserving and studying art at the grassroots level. She paused in front of Uncle Bob's research wall, which we'd recreated exactly as he'd left it. Look at this systematic approach to authentication and provenance research. Robert wasn't just buying art he liked, he was conducting serious scholarship, building knowledge that benefited the entire art community. James Morrison from Morrison and Associates had also attended the opening. He'd brought a surprise, a framed letter from the winning bidder on the largest Edgar Poe painting. The collector, a retired museum curator from San Francisco, had written to express his appreciation for Uncle Bob's careful preservation of the work. Mr. Chen, the letter read, "I wanted you to know that the Edgar Poe coastal study I acquired at auction will be donated to the Laguna Art Museum, where it will be properly preserved and displayed for future generations. Your uncle's research and documentation were instrumental in establishing the painting's authenticity and historical significance. His work ensured that an important piece of California art history will be preserved for posterity." Morrison presented the letter to Aunt Patricia with obvious emotion. Robert would have loved knowing that his research helped place that painting in a museum where it belongs. That's the kind of legacy most collectors only dream about achieving. The opening ceremony was small but meaningful. About 40 people attended, including neighbors who remembered Uncle Bob's quiet presence in the community, former colleagues from Riverside Community College where he'd taught, and several local artists who'd known him through gallery openings and art events. Each person seemed to have a story about Uncle Bob's generosity with his knowledge or his willingness to share his enthusiasm for art with anyone who showed genuine interest. Mrs. Henderson from next door approached me during the reception. "Your uncle used to come over and help me understand the paintings my grandmother left me," she said. "I thought they were just old decorations, but Bob spent hours showing me details I'd never noticed. He never made me feel stupid for not knowing about art. He just shared what he knew because he loved it." Tommy had driven down from Los Angeles for the ceremony. His relationship with Danny remained strained, but he'd made an effort to honor Uncle Bob's memory despite the family conflict. "Alex, I've been thinking a lot about what happened," he said as we stood looking at Uncle Bob's collection. "Danny always measured everything by its price tag. Uncle Bob measured things by their beauty and history. I want to be more like Uncle Bob." The legal aftermath of Danny's fraud case continued to unfold slowly. The criminal charges had resulted in his conviction on felony fraud charges, though he'd avoided jail time through a plea agreement that included full restitution and community service. The civil lawsuit was still pending, with Danny's insurance company fighting to avoid paying damages for what they claimed were intentional criminal acts not covered by his policy. Rodriguez had advised us that the civil case could take years to resolve completely, but the criminal conviction made our position strong. Danny admitted guilt in his plea agreement, Rodriguez explained. That makes the civil liability much clearer. The only question now is how much additional compensation you're entitled to for the emotional distress and legal costs. Sarah Martinez had been promoted at her law firm partly based on her work on our case, which had become something of a celebrated example of successful estate fraud prosecution. She'd written an article about it for the California State Bar Journal, focusing on the importance of proper documentation and expert testimony in art-related disputes.
Your uncle's meticulous record-keeping was what made this case winnable, Sarah told me over coffee near the courthouse after another hearing. If he hadn't documented his research so thoroughly, Danny might have gotten away with claiming ignorance about the collection's value. The financial impact of Uncle Bob's discovery had been life-changing for all three beneficiaries. My mother had used her inheritance to pay off her mortgage and establish a small scholarship fund at Riverside Community College for students studying art history. I'd invested most of mine but kept enough to pursue a graduate degree in art authentication, inspired by Uncle Bob's example and the realization that there was important work to be done in protecting cultural heritage. Aunt Patricia had been the most transformed by the experience. The shy, grieving widow who'd been overwhelmed by Danny's aggressive handling of the estate had become a confident advocate for art education and preservation. She'd used part of her inheritance to establish the Robert Chen Foundation for Art Research, which provided grants to amateur art historians and collectors conducting important scholarship outside of academic institutions. Bob always said that some of the best art discoveries came from people who weren't professional experts. Patricia explained during the Foundation's first grant award ceremony. He believed in curious people who took the time to really look at what they were seeing. This foundation will support that kind of careful, passionate research. The foundation's first grant went to a retired librarian in Carmel, who'd been researching a collection of early California plein air paintings found in a storage unit. Her work had already identified two previously unknown works by important regional artists, validating Uncle Bob's belief that significant discoveries were still waiting to be made by dedicated amateur researchers. Dr. Watson had become an informal advisor to the foundation, helping evaluate grant applications and connecting recipients with academic resources. Robert's legacy is inspiring a new generation of citizen art historians, she told me during one of her visits to the studio. That might be more valuable than any single painting he discovered. The Edgar Payne Coastal series had indeed gone to excellent homes. Beyond the piece donated to the Laguna Art Museum, two others had been acquired by the Smithsonian American Art Museum for their collection of California Impressionism. The remaining paintings had gone to serious private collectors who'd committed to making them available for research and eventual public display. Morrison and Associates had used Uncle Bob's story as an example in their collector education seminars, emphasizing the importance of proper research and documentation. Robert Chen demonstrates that valuable art discoveries don't just happen in dusty European castles, Morrison would tell his audiences. They happen in estate sales, garage sales, and storage units, but only for people who do their homework and understand what they're looking at. The most unexpected consequence of the whole experience had been the relationships that developed around Uncle Bob's legacy. Dr. Watson had connected me with other young people interested in art authentication, leading to an informal network of collectors and researchers who shared information and collaborated on difficult attribution problems. One of these new connections was Maria Gonzalez, a graduate student at UC San Diego who was working on a comprehensive catalog of Edgar Payne's works. Uncle Bob's research on the Coastal series had filled in several gaps in Payne's artistic chronology, and Maria had incorporated his findings into her dissertation. Your uncle's work will be cited in the definitive Edgar Payne catalog raisonné, Maria told me during one of her research visits to the studio. He'll be acknowledged alongside major art historians and museum curators. That's an incredible achievement for someone who was conducting research as a passionate amateur. The studio had become a quiet destination for art lovers and researchers. Word had spread through the California art community about Uncle Bob's collection and the story of its discovery. Visitors came to see the remaining paintings, to study his research methods, and to understand how careful documentation had turned a modest collection into a significant contribution to art history. One particularly meaningful visitor was Dr. Michael Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, who curated American art at the Los Angeles County Museum. He spent an entire afternoon going through Uncle Bob's research files and examining his collection methodology. What strikes me most about Robert's approach is how systematic and scholarly it was. Dr. Chen observed. He wasn't just accumulating artwork, he was building knowledge, creating connections between pieces, understanding artistic movements and influences. This is museum-quality research conducted in a garage workshop. The criminal case against Danny had broader implications beyond our family situation. The Riverside County District Attorney's Office had used it as a training example for prosecutors handling white-collar crime, and it had led to increased scrutiny of estate administration practices throughout the region. Detective Santos had told me that several other families had come forward with similar concerns about questionable estate handling after news of Danny's case became public. Your willingness to fight back probably prevented other families from being victimized, she said. Estate fraud is more common than people realize, but it's usually not prosecuted because families don't want to deal with the conflict and expense. Danny himself had largely disappeared from the family's life. His real estate business had suffered significant damage from the criminal conviction and civil lawsuit. Several major clients had ended their relationships with him after learning about the fraud case, and his professional reputation in Riverside had been permanently tarnished. Tommy occasionally provided updates about his brother's situation. Danny had moved to Arizona, where he was working as a salesperson for a large real estate firm rather than running his own business. The criminal conviction had made it difficult for him to obtain the licenses and insurance necessary for independent practice. He keeps saying he was just trying to handle things efficiently and that everyone overreacted, Tommy told me during one of his visits to the studio. He doesn't seem to understand that he tried to steal over $1 million from his own family. The lack of remorse is the most disturbing part. The psychological impact of Danny's betrayal had been profound for all of us, but it had also clarified something important about Uncle Bob's values and legacy. His careful research, his generous sharing of knowledge, his patience in building relationships with experts and fellow collectors, all of these qualities stood in stark contrast to Danny's rush for quick profit and disregard for family relationships. Aunt Patricia had put it most eloquently during a quiet moment at the studio opening. Bob spent his whole life teaching people that the most valuable things aren't always the most obvious ones. Beauty, knowledge, integrity. These things take time to develop and appreciate. Danny wanted instant gratification, and he was willing to destroy relationships to get it. Bob would have been sad about that, but not surprised. The tax implications of the inheritance had been complex but manageable. The IRS had accepted the court-ordered appraisals as official valuations for estate tax purposes, and Uncle Bob's careful documentation had made it possible to establish proper basis values for all the artwork. Rodriguez had worked with tax specialists to ensure that everyone's inheritance was handled correctly. Robert's record-keeping saved the estate hundreds of thousands of dollars in potential tax disputes, Rodriguez explained. The IRS could have challenged the values if the documentation hadn't been so thorough. His research didn't just identify valuable artwork, it protected the estate from audit problems. As the first anniversary of Uncle Bob's death approached, I found myself spending more time in the studio going through his books and notes, trying to understand how he developed his expertise over the decades. His personal library was remarkably sophisticated, filled with exhibition catalogs, auction records and scholarly texts on American art history. One evening while organizing his research files, I discovered a folder I'd missed during our initial search. It was labeled Future Projects and contained notes about several other potential discoveries he'd been investigating. One file contained photographs and preliminary research on a group of Depression-era photographs he'd found at an estate sale in Palm Springs. Another documented his investigation of what appeared to be early works by California modernist Henrietta Shore. These unfinished research projects represented Uncle Bob's continuing curiosity and his belief that important discoveries were always possible for people willing to do the work. I decided to continue some of his investigations, both as a way of honoring his memory and as training for my own developing expertise in art authentication. The Shore paintings proved particularly intriguing. Uncle Bob had identified them as potential early works based on style and technique, but he died before completing his authentication research. I reached out to the Henrietta Shore Society, an organization dedicated to preserving the artist's legacy, and learned that they were very interested in examining the works. Dr. Janet Morrison, the Society's president and a leading Shore scholar, agreed to evaluate the paintings. If these are authentic early Shore works, they would fill important gaps in our understanding of her artistic development, she explained during her visit to examine Uncle Bob's discoveries. Your uncle's eye was clearly excellent. These show all the characteristics we'd expect from Shore's transitional period in the early 1920s. The authentication process for the Shore paintings was lengthy and complex, involving technical analysis of paint samples, examination under ultraviolet light, and comparison with documented works from the same period. But after 6 months of research, Dr. Morrison confirmed that 3 of the 4 paintings were indeed authentic Henrietta Shore works, previously unknown to scholars. Your uncle discovered approximately $200,000 worth of previously unknown artwork by an important California modernist doctor, Morrison announced during a small ceremony at the studio. These paintings will be included in the revised Shore catalog Raisonné, and Robert Chen will be credited as their discoverer. The Shore discovery reinforced Uncle Bob's reputation as a serious art researcher and validated his methods for identifying overlooked masterpieces. More importantly, it demonstrated that his influence would continue beyond his death through the research projects he'd begun, and the people he'd inspired to appreciate art more deeply. The studio had evolved into something Uncle Bob probably never imagined but would have loved: a center for community art education and research. Local high school art classes visited regularly to learn about authentication techniques and art history research methods. The Riverside Community College Art Department had established a partnership with the studio, offering students hands-on experience with real research projects. One of these projects involved cataloging Uncle Bob's remaining collection and creating a digital archive of his research methods. The students learned to examine paintings under different lighting conditions, research artists' biographical information, and document provenance chains. Several students had changed their academic focus to art history as a result of working in the studio. Mr. Chen is still teaching, one student wrote in her final project report. Even though he's gone, his collection and research notes continue to show us how to really look at art, how to appreciate what previous generations of artists accomplished, and how to preserve that knowledge for the future. The legal resolution with Danny finally concluded 18 months after Uncle Bob's death. The civil lawsuit resulted in a substantial judgment against Danny for punitive damages beyond the restitution already paid. His homeowner's insurance ultimately covered part of the judgment after lengthy negotiations, but Danny was personally liable for approximately $300,000 in additional damages. Rodriguez had advised us that actually collecting the full judgment might take years, since Danny's finances had been severely impacted by the criminal case and the collapse of his real estate business. But the important thing is that the judgment is on record, Rodriguez explained. It serves as a permanent reminder that this kind of family betrayal has serious consequences. The final accounting of Uncle Bob's estate showed that his total collection had been worth approximately $1 million, significantly more than even the Edgar Payne paintings had initially suggested. His careful research and authentication work had created value that went far beyond the original purchase prices of the artwork. But the monetary value, while significant, had become less important than the cultural and educational legacy Uncle Bob had created. The studio attracted visitors from across California and beyond, people interested in learning about art collecting, authentication techniques, and the preservation of cultural heritage. A year after the legal case concluded, the studio hosted its first annual Robert Chen Memorial Lecture, featuring Dr. Watson speaking about the role of amateur researchers in art history. The audience included museum curators, academic art historians, collectors and students, all united by Uncle Bob's belief that careful observation and research could reveal hidden treasures and unexpected places. Robert Chen represents something essential about the democratic nature of art appreciation, Dr. Watson told the packed studio. You don't need an advanced degree or institutional affiliation to make meaningful contributions to our understanding of art history. You need curiosity, patience, and respect for the work itself. As the lecture concluded and guests mingled among Uncle Bob's carefully preserved collection, I reflected on how much had changed since that first shocking call from Danny about the funeral. What had begun as a family crisis had evolved into a celebration of intellectual curiosity, ethical behavior, and the power of careful research to reveal hidden truths. Uncle Bob would have been amazed by the scope of his legacy, but he would have been most proud of the people who'd been inspired to look more carefully at art, to value knowledge over quick profit, and to preserve cultural heritage for future generations. His greatest discovery wasn't any single painting. It was the demonstration that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they combine passion with persistence and integrity. Standing in the studio that evening, surrounded by Uncle Bob's books and research materials, I understood that his most valuable collection wasn't the artwork on the walls. It was the community of people he'd inspired to see beauty, seek truth, and share knowledge with others. That was a legacy worth far more than any auction price, and one that would continue growing long after the last painting had found its permanent home. 3 years had passed since Uncle Bob's death, and the ripple effects of his discovery continued to spread through the art world in ways none of us could have anticipated. What started as a family dispute over dismissed artwork had evolved into something much larger, a movement that was changing how museums, auction houses, and collectors approached authentication and provenance research. The Robert Chen Foundation for Art Research had grown beyond anything Aunt Patricia had initially envisioned. What began as a small fund to support amateur art historians had attracted attention from major cultural institutions across the country. The Smithsonian Institution had provided a matching grant to expand the foundation's scope, and the National Endowment for the Arts had designated it as a model program for community-based cultural preservation. Dr. Sarah Kim, the foundation's new executive director, had been recruited from the Getty Research Institute specifically because of her expertise in democratizing art historical research. What Robert Chen proved, Dr. Kim explained during the Foundation's third annual conference, is that some of the most important discoveries in art history are being made by people working outside traditional academic and museum structures. Our role is to support that work and help connect amateur researchers with the resources they need to make their findings known to the broader scholarly community. The conference had drawn over 200 attendees from across North America. Museum curators sat alongside retired teachers who discovered paintings in their attics. University professors shared research techniques with antique dealers who developed expertise in specific artists or periods. The atmosphere was unlike anything I'd experienced at traditional academic conferences. There was an infectious enthusiasm for discovery that Uncle Bob would have recognized immediately. One of the most compelling presentations came from Margaret Williams, a librarian from Portland who'd used Uncle Bob's research methods to authenticate a series of works progress administration murals that had been painted over during building renovations in the 1960s. Using infrared photography and careful historical research, she'd not only proven the mural's existence but had also identified the previously unknown artist responsible for them. I started by following Robert Chen's example of systematic documentation and patient research, Williams explained to the packed auditorium. What seemed like impossible detective work became manageable when I broke it down into small methodical steps. The artist's family had been told for decades that their grandfather's WPA work had been destroyed. Being able to prove that it still exists, hidden under layers of paint, has been incredibly meaningful for them. The foundation had also established partnerships with several major universities to create formal mentorship programs pairing amateur researchers with graduate students and faculty members. I'd become involved in the program through my graduate work in art authentication at UCLA, where I was completing my master's degree with Dr. Watson as my advisor. My thesis project focused on developing standardized protocols for authenticating works by California regional artists, using Uncle Bob's Edgar Payne research as a case study. The work had practical applications beyond academia. Several auction houses were implementing similar protocols to improve their authentication processes and reduce the risk of fraud. Your uncle's documentation methods have become a gold standard in the field, Dr. Watson told me during one of our thesis meetings. What he did intuitively: systematic photography, comprehensive provenance research, technical analysis when possible, is now being taught in graduate programs as best practice for attribution work. The Edgar Payne Coastal series had continued to make news in the art world. The Smithsonian's acquisition of 2 of the paintings had led to a major exhibition on California Impressionism that toured the country for 2 years. Uncle Bob was credited as co-discoverer in all the exhibition materials, and his research methods were featured in the exhibition catalog as an example of exemplary collector scholarship. More significantly, the Smithsonian had used Uncle Bob's documentation as the basis for new acquisition guidelines that emphasized the importance of collector research in establishing provenance and authenticity. Robert Chen's work demonstrates that serious collectors can contribute meaningfully to art historical scholarship, the museum's press release had announced. His research will inform our understanding of Edgar Payne's work for generations to come. The studio behind Uncle Bob's house had evolved into something approaching a small museum. The Riverside City Council had designated it as an official cultural landmark, and the California Arts Council had provided funding to expand the facility and improve its climate control systems for long-term artwork preservation. The expansion had allowed us to display more of Uncle Bob's collection and to create dedicated research spaces where visitors could examine his documentation methods up close. Interactive displays showed how he'd used different types of lighting to examine brushwork, how he'd photographed paintings to reveal details invisible to casual observation, and how he'd built comprehensive files connecting individual works to broader artistic movements. One of the most popular features was a recreation of Uncle Bob's workspace exactly as he'd left it, complete with his art books open to relevant pages, research notes spread across the desk, and magnifying equipment positioned as if he'd just stepped away for coffee. Visitors often spent long periods studying his research methods, trying to understand how a retired community college instructor had developed such sophisticated expertise. The educational impact had been extraordinary. The studio now hosted regular workshops on art authentication, collector ethics, and research methodology. Participants ranged from casual art lovers to serious collectors to museum professionals seeking to improve their own practices. The workshops consistently filled to capacity with waiting lists extending months in advance. One particularly meaningful workshop had been designed specifically for families dealing with inherited artwork. Too many people were making decisions about valuable pieces without understanding their significance, either selling important works for pennies or keeping damaged pieces that could be restored. Uncle Bob's story served as both cautionary tale and inspiration for taking inherited art seriously. Every family has that weird painting that's been in the attic for decades, explained workshop leader Jennifer Martinez, a professional appraiser who'd become fascinated by Uncle Bob's story. Most of the time it really is just a decorative piece with sentimental value. But sometimes it's something significant that's been overlooked. Robert Chen's example shows us how to tell the difference. The workshops had led to several notable discoveries. A woman from San Bernardino had brought photographs of paintings she'd inherited from her grandmother, including one that Uncle Bob's documentation methods helped identify as an authentic work by California artist Maynard Dixon. A retired couple from Phoenix had used the studio's research resources to authenticate a small sculpture that proved to be an early work by a significant Southwestern artist. Each discovery reinforced Uncle Bob's belief that important artwork was often hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone with the knowledge and patience to recognize its significance. The studio maintained a registry of these finds, creating a database that was proving valuable to researchers studying regional art markets and collecting patterns. The legal ramifications of Danny's fraud case had extended far beyond our family situation. The California State Bar had used the case as the basis for new guidelines on estate administration, particularly regarding the handling of potentially valuable collectibles and artwork. Several other states had adopted similar guidelines, and the case was frequently cited in legal education materials. Rodriguez had become something of a specialist in estate fraud cases involving art and collectibles, often consulting on similar situations across the country. The Chen case established important precedents about fiduciary responsibility and disclosure requirements, he explained during a presentation to the State Bar's estate planning section. Executors can no longer claim ignorance about asset values when they have access to expert evaluation resources. The criminal justice implications had been equally significant. Danny's conviction had led to increased scrutiny of estate administration practices by law
enforcement agencies. Detective Santos had been promoted partly based on her work on the case and had developed training programs for other investigators dealing with white-collar crime in family contexts. Estate fraud is much more common than most people realize. Detective Santos explained during a conference on elder abuse and family financial crimes. The Chen case shows how family members can exploit trust and information asymmetries to steal significant assets. But it also demonstrates that these crimes can be successfully prosecuted when victims are willing to fight back and when proper documentation exists. Danny's personal situation had continued to deteriorate. The civil judgment against him had been partially satisfied through asset seizure, but he remained liable for hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages. His attempts to rebuild his career in Arizona had been hampered by the criminal conviction and the civil judgment, both of which appeared in background checks for professional licensing. Tommy had tried to maintain some relationship with his brother, but even he had grown frustrated with Danny's continued refusal to accept responsibility for his actions. He still talks about the whole thing like it was just a misunderstanding, Tommy told me during one of his visits to California. He acts like we're the ones who overreacted to what he calls a business disagreement. He genuinely doesn't seem to understand that he tried to steal over $1 million from his own family. The psychological impact of the betrayal had been profound and lasting. Family gatherings remained strained, with Danny's absence creating an uncomfortable void that everyone felt but no one wanted to discuss directly. The money had been recovered and justice had been served, but the emotional damage to family relationships had proven more difficult to repair. Aunt Patricia had handled the situation with remarkable grace, channeling her energy into the foundation and the studio rather than dwelling on the betrayal. Bob would have said that we can choose to be bitter about what happened or grateful for what we discovered. She reflected during a quiet moment at the studio. I choose gratitude. Danny's greed led us to understand the true value of Bob's work and to share it with people who can appreciate it. The Foundation's scholarship program had supported over 50 research projects by amateur art historians, leading to dozens of significant discoveries and authentications. The program had become so successful that major auction houses were now partnering with it to identify potential consignors who might have valuable works without realizing their significance. One of the most remarkable discoveries had come from Maria Santos, a high school art teacher in New Mexico, who'd received a foundation grant to research a group of paintings she'd inherited from a great-aunt. Her systematic application of Uncle Bob's research methods had led to the identification of several works by early Santa Fe artists, including 2 paintings by a member of Los Cinco Pintores that were worth over $100,000 each. The foundation gave me the tools and confidence to take my inheritance seriously, Santos explained during her presentation at the annual conference. Without Robert Chen's example and the research support, I would have just enjoyed the paintings without ever knowing their historical significance. Now they're being donated to the New Mexico Museum of Art, where they'll be properly preserved and displayed. The museum partnerships had grown beyond anyone's initial expectations.
The Laguna Art Museum had created a permanent exhibition space dedicated to Uncle Bob's Edgar Payne research, displaying the paintings alongside his documentation methods and research findings. The exhibition drew visitors from around the world who were interested in both the artwork and the story of its discovery. Similar exhibitions had been mounted at museums in Santa Fe, San Francisco, and Phoenix, each focusing on how amateur research was contributing to scholarly understanding of regional art movements. Uncle Bob's story had become emblematic of a broader democratization of art history, where passionate amateurs were making contributions previously thought to require advanced academic training. The digital preservation project had exceeded all expectations. The complete digitization of Uncle Bob's research materials, correspondence, and documentation methods had created an online resource that was being used by researchers worldwide. The archive received thousands of visits monthly from people researching specific artists, authentication techniques, or collector methodologies. The most popular section was Uncle Bob's correspondence with experts, which provided insight into how he'd built relationships with scholars and auction house specialists. His patient, respectful approach to requesting information and his willingness to share his own findings had created a network of collaborators who'd been eager to help with his research. Robert Chen understood that art history is collaborative, observed Dr. Michael Harrison, a curator at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, who'd worked with Uncle Bob on several attribution questions. He never tried to hoard information or claim exclusive ownership of his discoveries. He saw himself as part of a larger community of people working to understand and preserve cultural heritage. The authentication workshop program had expanded to include online components, making Uncle Bob's research methods accessible to people who couldn't travel to California. The virtual workshops had attracted participants from across the globe, creating an international community of amateur researchers who shared techniques, resources, and discoveries. One particularly active online group focused on Depression-era American art, using Uncle Bob's systematic approach to identify and authenticate works from the 1930s and 1940s. The group had made several significant discoveries, including the identification of previously unknown works progress administration artworks and the authentication of pieces by artists who'd been largely forgotten by mainstream art history. The tax implications of art authentication had become another area where Uncle Bob's case provided important precedents. The IRS had accepted the court-ordered appraisals as definitive valuations, establishing guidelines for how amateur research could be used to support professional appraisals. Several tax court cases had cited Uncle Bob's documentation methods as examples of proper substantiation for charitable deductions and estate valuations. The international attention had been unexpected but significant. Art historians and collectors from Europe, Australia, and Japan had visited the studio to study Uncle Bob's methods and examine his collection. Several international symposiums on art authentication had featured presentations about his work, and his research techniques were being adapted for use with artists and movements from other countries and periods. The French Ministry of Culture had sent a delegation to study the Foundation's programs as a potential model for supporting amateur art historical research in France. The American tradition of citizen scholarship in cultural fields is something we would like to encourage in our own country, explained Dr. Claire Dubois, the delegation's leader. Robert Chen's example demonstrates how passionate individuals can contribute meaningfully to our understanding of artistic heritage. The insurance industry had also taken notice of Uncle Bob's story, using it as a case study in their guidelines for covering art collections. Several major insurers had revised their policies to encourage proper documentation and authentication, offering premium discounts for collectors who maintained research files similar to Uncle Bob's systematic approach. The final legal resolution with Danny had included provisions for ongoing monitoring of his compliance with restitution requirements. The judgment specified that any future inheritance or significant financial gain would be subject to garnishment until the full amount was satisfied. This had effectively ended Danny's prospects for wealth accumulation, creating a permanent financial consequence for his fraudulent actions. The broader cultural impact continued to unfold in unexpected ways. Uncle Bob's story had been featured in documentary films, magazine articles, and academic papers about the democratization of cultural knowledge. His example was being cited by proponents of open access to cultural resources and by critics of exclusive academic gatekeeping in art history. The studio's educational programs had inspired similar initiatives at other cultural institutions. Museums in several cities had created programs pairing amateur researchers with professional curators, recognizing that passionate individuals often possessed specialized knowledge that complemented traditional academic expertise. As I stood in the studio on the 5th anniversary of Uncle Bob's death, surrounded by evidence of his continuing influence on the art world, I thought about how perfectly his legacy embodied the values he'd lived by. His patient research had revealed hidden treasures. His generous sharing of knowledge had inspired others to look more carefully at the cultural heritage around them. His integrity in the face of family betrayal had demonstrated that doing the right thing sometimes required courage but was always worth the effort. The anniversary ceremony drew the largest crowd yet to the studio. Dr. Watson delivered the keynote address about the evolving role of amateur researchers in art history. Museum directors, auction house specialists, collectors, students, and community members filled the space to capacity, testament to the broad impact of Uncle Bob's work. Robert Chen never sought fame or recognition for his discoveries, Dr. Watson concluded her remarks. He simply wanted to understand the art he loved and to share that understanding with others. In doing so, he demonstrated something profound about the nature of cultural preservation. It's not the exclusive domain of institutions and experts. It's the responsibility of anyone who recognizes that our artistic heritage deserves careful attention and respectful stewardship. As the ceremony concluded and guests explored the expanded displays of Uncle Bob's research methods and discoveries, I realized that his greatest achievement wasn't any single painting he'd authenticated or any particular discovery he'd made. His greatest achievement was proving that curiosity combined with systematic research and ethical behavior could create lasting value that extended far beyond any individual collection or career. The young visitors at the anniversary ceremony, many of them students or early career professionals inspired by Uncle Bob's example, represented the future of cultural preservation. They understood that important discoveries were still waiting to be made, that valuable artwork was still being overlooked or underestimated, and that patient research could reveal truths that transformed our understanding of artistic heritage. Uncle Bob would have been amazed by the scope of his influence, but he would have been most proud of the principle it demonstrated that ordinary people, armed with genuine curiosity and commitment to truth, could accomplish extraordinary things. His collection had been valuable, but his example was priceless. Standing in the studio that evening, watching animated conversations between established scholars and passionate amateurs, I understood that Uncle Bob's most important discovery would never appear in any auction catalog or museum exhibition. He discovered that the pursuit of knowledge, conducted with integrity and shared generously, created a kind of wealth that could never be stolen, never be devalued, and never stop growing. That was a legacy worth inheriting, worth preserving, and worth passing on to future generations of people who understood that the most valuable things in life were often the ones that required patience, dedication, and careful attention to recognize. 10 years after Uncle Bob's passing, I found myself walking through the halls of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, carrying a portfolio that would have seemed impossible during those first dark days of family conflict. The museum had invited me to present Uncle Bob's authentication methods as part of their annual symposium on collector contributions to art historical scholarship. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save dismissed paintings from a dumpster had evolved into internationally recognized expertise in art authentication and provenance research. The symposium room was filled with the kind of audience Uncle Bob had always dreamed of reaching: museum curators, private collectors, auction house specialists, and graduate students, all united by genuine passion for understanding and preserving artistic heritage. My presentation focused on how systematic documentation and patient research could reveal hidden masterpieces, using Uncle Bob's Edgar Payne discovery as the foundation for broader principles that had since been applied to authentication work worldwide. During the question period, a curator from the Musée d'Orsay asked about the psychological factors that enabled amateur researchers to make discoveries that professional institutions might miss. I replied, thinking of Uncle Bob's patient hours in his garage workshop, it comes down to having the luxury of time and the freedom to follow curiosity wherever it leads. Professional researchers often work under pressure to publish quickly or focus on established artists. Amateur researchers can spend years investigating a single painting because they're genuinely fascinated by the mystery. After the presentation, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison from Harvard's Art History Department approached me with an intriguing proposition. She'd been following the Robert Chen Foundation's work for several years and wanted to establish a formal partnership between Harvard and the foundation to create the first graduate program specifically designed to train professional art historians in techniques developed by amateur researchers. What your uncle demonstrated, and what the foundation has continued to prove, is that some of the most important authentication work is being done by people working outside traditional academic structures. Dr. Morrison explained over coffee near the museum. We want to create a program that combines rigorous academic training with the patient, systematic approach that characterized Robert's work. The Harvard partnership represented validation of something Uncle Bob had always believed, that careful observation and systematic research were more important than institutional credentials in understanding art. The proposed program would require students to complete traditional coursework but also to work directly with amateur researchers on active authentication projects, learning techniques that weren't taught in conventional art history programs. The program's first cohort would include students working on projects inspired directly by Uncle Bob's research methods. One student was investigating a collection of Depression-era photographs that might include unknown works by Dorothea Lange. Another was applying Uncle Bob's systematic approach to authenticating works attributed to members of the Harlem Renaissance. Each project demonstrated how his techniques could be adapted to different periods, media, and artistic movements. The international expansion of these methods had produced remarkable results. In Italy, a retired mathematics professor had used Uncle Bob's documentation techniques to authenticate a series of Renaissance drawings found in a monastery library. The drawings, previously dismissed as student copies, proved to be preparatory sketches by a significant Florentine artist, providing new insight into workshop practices of the 15th century. Similar discoveries were being made across Europe, Asia, and Latin America by researchers who'd learned Uncle Bob's methods through the Foundation's online resources and international workshop programs. A teacher in Japan had identified previously unknown works by early 20th century modernists. A librarian in Mexico had authenticated colonial-era religious paintings that had been stored in a cathedral basement for decades. Each discovery validated Uncle Bob's core belief that important artwork existed in unexpected places, waiting for someone with the knowledge and dedication to recognize its significance. The global network of researchers using his methods had grown into thousands of people, creating an informal but effective system for identifying and preserving cultural heritage that might otherwise be lost or overlooked. The Foundation's work had attracted attention from major technology companies interested in developing digital tools to support art authentication. A partnership with a Silicon Valley firm had produced software that could analyze brushwork patterns, compare stylistic elements across multiple works, and maintain comprehensive databases of artistic techniques. The technology was sophisticated, but it was designed to augment rather than replace the careful human observation that remained central to Uncle Bob's approach. Danny's story had taken an unexpected turn in recent years. After a decade of struggling with the financial and reputational consequences of his fraud conviction, he'd experienced what seemed to be genuine remorse for his actions. Tommy had reported that Danny had been attending therapy sessions focused on understanding the psychological factors that had led to his betrayal of family trust. The transformation, if genuine, had come too late to repair the damaged relationships, but it had led to one meaningful gesture. Danny had contacted Rodriguez with an offer to participate in educational programs about estate fraud, sharing his story as a cautionary example for other families. His willingness to publicly discuss his mistakes had added an important dimension to the Foundation's educational work. I want people to understand how easy it is to rationalize bad decisions when money is involved, Danny had said during his first presentation to a group of estate planning attorneys. I convinced myself I was being practical and efficient when I was really just being greedy. The damage to my family relationships has been far worse than any financial consequences. These presentations had become surprisingly effective components of the Foundation's educational programs. Danny's first-hand account of how financial pressure and family dynamics could lead to ethical compromises resonated with audiences in ways that abstract discussions of fiduciary duty could not. His participation didn't excuse his actions or fully repair the relationships he'd damaged, but it demonstrated that even people who'd made serious mistakes could contribute to preventing others from following similar paths. The studio in Riverside had continued to evolve, becoming a pilgrimage destination for art lovers and researchers from around the world. The city had recognized its cultural significance by creating a small museum district around it, with related galleries and educational facilities that complemented Uncle Bob's original workspace. The area had become an economic driver for the community, attracting tourists and researchers who stayed in local hotels and ate at nearby restaurants. The museum expansion had allowed for the display of more discoveries made using Uncle Bob's methods, creating a continuously updated exhibition of authentication success stories. Visitors could see before and after examples of cleaning and restoration work, examine the documentation process that revealed hidden signatures or authentic materials, and learn about the historical research that placed individual works within broader artistic movements. One of the most popular exhibits featured interactive stations where visitors could practice Uncle Bob's observation techniques on reproduction artworks. Using proper lighting equipment and magnification tools, people could examine brushwork patterns, color layering techniques, and surface textures, developing the kind of careful-looking skills that Uncle Bob had considered essential for understanding art. The educational impact extended far beyond professional researchers and serious collectors. School groups regularly visited the studio, where they learned about the scientific methods used in art authentication and the historical detective work involved in establishing provenance. Many young visitors left with a new appreciation for the complexity and sophistication involved in creating and preserving artistic works. The Foundation's scholarship program had supported hundreds of research projects, leading to discoveries that had significantly expanded knowledge of American art history. The cumulative impact was remarkable. Previously unknown works by major artists, forgotten regional movements, brought back to scholarly attention, and techniques for identifying authentic works that had revolutionized authentication practices across the art world. Dr. Watson, now in her 70s and nearing retirement, had become the Foundation's senior advisor and the most eloquent spokesperson for Uncle Bob's legacy. Robert Chen proved that passion combined with systematic methodology could produce scholarship that rivaled anything coming from major institutions, she reflected during a recent interview. More importantly, he demonstrated that preserving cultural heritage is not the exclusive responsibility of museums and universities. It's work that requires the participation of anyone who recognizes that art connects us to our history and to each other. The financial management of Uncle Bob's legacy had been handled with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized his art research. The Foundation had grown into a multi-million-dollar organization supported by donations from grateful families whose inherited artwork had been properly identified and valued, using techniques developed through Uncle Bob's example. The largest single donation had come from the estate of Maria Santos, the New Mexico teacher, whose foundation supported research had led to the authentication of valuable Santa Fe school paintings. She'd left her entire estate to the foundation, specifying that the funds should support research into overlooked works by women artists and artists from underrepresented communities. This bequest had enabled the foundation to launch new programs focused on diversifying art historical scholarship and ensuring that the systematic research methods Uncle Bob had developed were applied to the full range of American artistic heritage. The programs were identifying important works by African American, Latino, Native American, and women artists who had been marginalized by traditional art historical scholarship. The international recognition of Uncle Bob's methods had led to invitations to advise governments and cultural institutions on protecting and preserving artistic heritage. The techniques developed through his example were being used to authenticate works in repatriation cases, to identify stolen art in recovery operations, and to establish proper valuations for insurance and tax purposes. The legacy had grown beyond anything Uncle Bob could have imagined, but it remained true to the principles he'd embodied: patient research, generous sharing of knowledge, and unwavering commitment to truth. His story continued to inspire people who understood that some of the most important work in preserving cultural heritage was being done quietly, methodically, and with deep respect for the artistic achievements of previous generations. As I prepared to leave New York after the symposium, I received a message from the current director of the studio in Riverside. A young graduate student had arrived that morning with photographs of paintings she'd inherited from her grandmother, convinced that one might be an authentic work by Georgia O'Keeffe. She'd driven from Phoenix, specifically because she'd heard about Uncle Bob's research methods and wanted to learn how to investigate her paintings properly. The circle continued, I thought, smiling as I read the message. Somewhere in Riverside, another person was learning to look carefully at art, to ask the right questions, and to pursue answers with the kind of patient dedication that Uncle Bob had exemplified. The paintings might prove to be authentic masterpieces or treasured family heirlooms with primarily sentimental value, but either way, they would receive the careful attention and respectful investigation they deserved. That was Uncle Bob's true gift to the world, not any single discovery or authentication, but the demonstration that treating cultural heritage with serious attention and systematic respect could reveal truths that enriched everyone's understanding of human creativity. His legacy lived on, in every person who chose to look more carefully, research more thoroughly, and preserve more thoughtfully the artistic achievements that connect us to our shared cultural history. The story that began with family betrayal and nearly lost masterpieces had become something much larger, a testament to the power of integrity, curiosity, and careful attention to transform not just individual understanding but entire fields of knowledge. Uncle Bob would have been proud of that transformation, but not surprised by it. He'd always known that the most valuable discoveries were made by people willing to take the time to really see what they were looking at. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.